A bobcat refuses to leave a woman's coffin. But when the doctor finds out why his blood runs cold, because she wasn't dead. She'd been buried alive by mistake, her pulse silenced by a pharmacy error. And the only one who knew the truth was the animal everyone wanted to drag away. This wasn't loyalty, it was a rescue. The growl at the grave site, the paw scratching the coffin lid, the exact same spot where heartbeat was still flickering faint but fighting. The doctor had one chance to stop the burial, but would anyone believe a bobcat? Was this wild creature mourning his owner, or trying to save her life before it was too late? But before we begin, please hit the like button and let me know where in the world you're watching from today. It's always fascinating seeing who's joining us from around the world. The evening sun cast long shadows through Miriam's kitchen window as she worked methodically at her wooden cutting board. The steady thunk of her knife against the board created a rhythm that matched the quiet tune she hummed, an old folk song her mother used to sing. Carrots, potatoes, and onions fell into neat piles as she prepared her dinner, near the crackling fireplace. Lark stretched out on the braided rug, his muscular form relaxed but alert. His golden eyes tracked Miriam's movements with lazy interest, whiskers twitching at the savory smells beginning to fill the kitchen. The bobcat's purr rumbled, softly, adding a bass note to Miriam's melody. "Almost done, old friend," Miriam said, smiling at her unusual companion. She dropped the vegetables into the pot of simmering broth, watching steam rise in delicate spirals. The familiar scent of herbs, rosemary and thyme from her garden, wafted through the cozy space. The first wave of dizziness hit without warning. Miriam blinked hard, gripping the edge of the table as the room seemed to tilt sideways. "Just tired," she muttered, pressing her free hand to her forehead. But the vertigo intensified, making the kitchen swim before her eyes. The wooden spoon clattered from her grip, landing with this splash in the pot. Lark's head snapped up, his ears pricking forward. He rose to his feet, muscles tensing beneath his spotted coat. "I just need to sit ... Miriam's words slurred as she tried to reach the nearby chair. Her legs buckled beneath her, and she crumpled to the floor with a soft thud. The room spun wildly, ceiling and walls blending together in a nauseating whirl. She could hear the pot beginning to bubble too vigorously, smell the first hints of scorching vegetables. Lark patted over, his large paws silent on the wooden floor. He nosed at her face, whiskers tickling her cheek. When she didn't respond, he let out a low, distressed sound, somewhere between a growl and a whine. He pawed at her arm, trying to rouse her. Miriam tried to lift her hand to comfort him, but her limbs felt impossibly heavy. Her breathing grew shallow, each inhale a struggle. Through dimming vision, she watched Lark pace anxiously around her. Prone form, his tail switching back and forth in agitation. The acrid smell of burning stew grew stronger, smoke beginning to curl from the pot on the stove. Outside, Martha Jenkins paused in her evening walk, frowning at the way the smoke from Miriam's chimney billowed strangely in the still air. Something about it seemed wrong. "Tom," she called to her husband, who was checking their mailbox. "Something's not right at Miriam's." The couple hurried up Miriam's front path, worry increasing as they spotted the smoke now seeping from under the door. Tom didn't bother knocking, pushing the door open to find the kitchen filled with a light haze. "Miriam!" Martha gasped, spotting their friend on the floor. She rushed forward but stopped short as Lark positioned himself between them and Miriam's. Still form, the bobcat's ears lay flat against his head, a warning growl rumbling in his chest. Tom quickly moved to the stove, removing the ruined pot from the heat. Martha knelt as close as Lark would allow, watching Miriam's chest barely rise and fall. When she reached out tentatively, Lark's growl deepened. "Her skin's so cool," Martha whispered, having managed to brush Miriam's hand before Lark's warning. "Made her retreat. Tom, get Dr. Elias. Hurry." Tom nodded grimly and rushed out the door. Martha settled on the floor a safe distance from Lark, who had curled himself protectively around Miriam's shoulders. His golden eyes never left Martha's face, his low growl a constant reminder that he would allow no one to harm his beloved friend. "It's all right, Lark," Martha murmured, though her voice shook. "Help is coming." "We won't let anything happen to?" The Bobcat's only response was to press closer to Miriam's side, his fierce devotion evident in every line of his powerful body. As they waited for the doctor to arrive, Dr. Elias hurried down the dirt path toward Miriam's house, his weathered medical bag clutched tightly in one hand, a brass lantern swinging from the other. The setting sun had given way to deep purple twilight, and a small crowd of villagers followed in his wake. Their worried whispers carried on the evening breeze. "She was fine just yesterday," Mrs. Peterson muttered, wringing her hands. "Teaching the children about butterflies in her garden, ... Hush now," someone else whispered back. "Let the doctor work." The atmosphere grew heavier as they approached Miriam's front door. Martha Jenkins stood in the doorway, her face drawn with concern. "She hasn't moved, doctor. And that cat won't let anyone near her." Elias nodded grimly, stepping into the kitchen. The burnt smell of dinner still lingered in the air, mixing with the sharper scent of fear. His eyes adjusted to the dim interior, where Miriam lay motionless on the floor, Lark still maintaining his protective vigil. "Lark," Elias said softly, setting down his bag. He treated the Bobcat's injuries before and hoped their past encounters would work in his favor now. "I need to help her, old friend." The Bobcat's ears flattened, but his growl was softer than before. Elias moved slowly, keeping his movements deliberate and calm. To everyone's surprise, Lark shifted slightly, allowing the doctor to kneel beside Miriam while maintaining his close watch. Elias's practiced hands moved quickly, checking for vital signs. He pressed fingers against her neck, frowning at the cold, clammy skin. No pulse met his touch. He held a small mirror to her lips, watching for the faintest sign of breath. Nothing clouded the glass. "Bring the lantern closer," he commanded, and Tom Jenkins complied. In the stronger light, Elias noted the bluish tinge to Miriam's lips, the absolute stillness of her chest. He listened with his stethoscope, moving it repeatedly, desperate to catch any sound of life. After several long minutes, he sat back on his heels, face heavy with grief. "She's gone," he announced quietly. "Appears to be sudden cardiac failure." A collective sigh of sorrow swept through the gathered villagers. Mrs. Peterson began to weep softly, and others bowed their heads in respect. Lark made a sound somewhere between a whimper and a growl, pressing his nose against Miriam's hand. "Someone needs to notify Jonas," Martha said, naming Miriam's brother. Though they'd grown apart over the years, he still lived in the next town over. "I'll ride out," Tom offered. "He should know tonight." Elias pulled out his official papers, hands trembling slightly as he wrote the death certificate by lantern. Light. He'd always admired Miriam's quiet strength, the way she devoted herself to teaching the village children despite her own hardships. Just last week, she'd stopped by his office with fresh bread and stories about her students' latest achievements. The women of the village stepped forward to perform their solemn duty, gently washing Miriam's body and dressing her in her best blue dress, the one she wore to church on Sundays. Throughout their ministrations, Lark paced nearby, his golden eyes never leaving his friend. Word came back that Jonas would arrive by dawn. Meanwhile, the men carried Miriam's body to the small chapel, placing her in the simple wooden coffin that the carpenter kept ready for such occasions. They arranged candles around it, their flames casting dancing shadows on the whitewashed walls. "The cat needs to stay outside," one of the men suggested, but Lark ignored all attempts to remove him. He circled the coffin restlessly, occasionally rising on his hind legs to peer inside, as if checking that Miriam was still their dot as midnight approached. The villagers gradually departed to their homes, leaving offerings of flowers and handwritten prayers. Only Dr. Elias remained, standing in the chapel's doorway, watching Lark's continued vigil with growing unease. The Bobcat's behavior puzzled him. In all his years of practice, he'd seen many animals' reactions to death. They typically fled from it, their instincts driving them away from the stillness of mortality. Yet Lark remained, his attention fixed on Miriam with unwavering intensity. Elias approached the coffin one last time, gazing down at Miriam's peaceful face in the candlelight. Strange, he whispered, glancing at the ever-vigilant. Lark, they usually flee from death. With those words, he turned and walked out of the chapel. Leaving Lark to his solitary watch, dawn's rays painted the chapel windows, casting colored patterns across the floor. Villagers pushed open the creaking doors to pay respects before work. Lark hadn't moved from beside the coffin. His tawny fur gleamed in the morning light, golden eyes alert. Night candles had burned low, wax pooling in silver holders. Mrs. Peterson entered first, a Bible clutched to her chest. She paused, seeing the Bobcat. "He's been there all night," she whispered to Martha Jenkins. "Never seen anything like it." More villagers entered, speaking in hushed tones while eyeing Lark. "It's not natural," Tom Wilson muttered. "Wild animal? Should have gone back to the woods." "It's loyalty," Martha countered emotionally. "That cat loved her like family." Miriam saved him as a cub. Jonas appeared, face drawn and shoulders tense. His boots echoed as he approached, stopping when Lark's ears flattened. "That animal needs to be outside," Jonas declared. "This is a house of God, not a menagerie." "Your sister loved that cat like her child," Martha argued. "He has every right to be here, right?" Jonas scoffed. "It's a wild animal. Someone fetch a rope. We'll tie it outside." No one moved to help. Sarah Thompson spoke firmly. "That cat hasn't caused trouble. He's grieving like us. He stays." Dr. Elias entered, silver-haired and still carrying his medical bag. Lark suddenly rose and paced along the coffin, pawing insistently at the wood near Miriam's hand. Elias watched intently. He'd seen Lark show awareness of Miriam's condition before, especially her heart troubles. "Has he been doing that all night?" Elias asked Martha. "On and off." "Keeps focusing on that same spot?" Elias frowned, recalling Miriam mentioning a pharmacy. "Supplier change?" "I need to check something," he announced, heading for the door dot at Miriam's house. He examined her medicine bottles carefully. His hands shook as he compared two similar labels with a critical difference in medication codes. Her heart medication had been replaced with a powerful sedative. Elias sank into a chair. This sedative could slow vital signs to nearly undetectable levels without sophisticated tests. "Dear God," he whispered. "She may not be gone." Evening shadows stretched long across the cobblestone streets as Dr. Elias hurried back through the village, the medicine bottles clinking softly in his coat pockets. The chapel bells tolled 7 times, their mournful sound echoing off the ancient stone buildings. Through the chapel's stained glass windows, candlelight flickered as villagers maintained their vigil over Miriam's body. His footsteps quickened as he reached his small clinic, fumbling with cold fingers to unlock the door. Inside, he lit several oil lamps and pulled his medical texts from their shelves, sending dust motes dancing in the lamplight. The book's leather bindings creaked as he opened them on his desk, pages rustling as he searched frantically through chapters on sedatives and their effects. "Here," he muttered, running his finger along the yellowed page. "Severe cases of overdose can result in a state of suspended animation, commonly referred to as pseudo-death." His heart pounded as he read further. "Vital signs may become undetectable without specialized equipment. Recovery possible once drug metabolizes, typically within 24 to 48 hours of initial dose." Elias slumped in his chair, running trembling hands through his gray hair. The gravity of this situation pressed down on him like a physical weight. If his suspicions were correct, Miriam was alive in that coffin, trapped in a death-like sleep. But if he was wrong, "They'll think I've lost my mind," he whispered to the empty room. Years of respect in this community, gone in an instant. He could already imagine the whispers, the sidelong glances, the loss of trust that would follow if he raised a false alarm. But the alternative was far worse. The image of Miriam, helpless and unconscious, being lowered into the cold ground made him shudder. Her eventual awakening in that dark space would be a horror beyond imagination. He worked through the night, cross-referencing symptoms and dosages, checking and rechecking his conclusions. The more he read, the more certain he became. When dawn finally broke, his eyes were red-rimmed, but determined. The morning brought a flurry of activity to the village square. Black-clothed mourners gathered as the funeral preparations began. Wreaths of white lily appeared on the chapel door, their sweet scent mixing with the morning mist. Jonas stood on the chapel steps, directing the pallbearers with sharp gestures. "The grave's been dug since dawn," he announced. "No sense in waiting. We'll proceed within the hour." Martha Jenkins wrung her hands anxiously. "Isn't it customary to wait another day?" "To be certain? Certain?" Jonas's laugh was bitter. "The doctor himself declared her dead. What more certainty do you need?" His voice carried an edge of barely controlled grief. "I want this done, proper and dignified, before the weather turns." The villagers exchanged uneasy glances, but didn't argue. Jonas was family after all, and they had no grounds to challenge his wishes. Elias burst into the square, just as the pallbearers were positioning themselves beside the coffin. His normally neat appearance was disheveled, his medical bag clutched tightly in one hand. "Stop," he called out, pushing through the crowd. "You must delay the burial. There's been a terrible mistake." Jonas turned, his face darkening. "What are you talking about, doctor?" Elias held up the medicine bottles, trying to catch his breath. "The pharmacy, they mixed up her prescriptions. This sedative in high doses, it can mimic death. We need to wait to be absolutely certain." "Enough?" Jonas cut him off sharply. "First you declare her dead, and now you want to tell me she isn't? Is this your idea of covering your incompetence, doctor?" Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Some looked thoughtful, others skeptical. The pallbearers shifted uncomfortably, awaiting direction. "Please," Elias pleaded, "just give me time to explain." "Proceed," Jonas commanded the pallbearers. They hesitated only briefly before lifting the coffin. The funeral procession began its slow march toward the cemetery hill. Elias watched in horror as they carried Miriam away, his voice growing hoarse from shouting after them. Suddenly, a tawny blur streaked past him. Lark, who had been watching intently from the chapel steps, launched himself through the air and landed on the coffin lid with a heavy thud. The impact nearly caused the pallbearers to stumble. The Bobcat's muscles were coiled tight, his teeth bared in a fierce snarl that stopped everyone in their tracks. The funeral procession ground to a halt at the base of Cemetery Hill. Lark's claws scraped against the polished wood of the coffin, sending splinters flying as he defended his position. His muscles rippled beneath his tawny coat, and his fierce growl echoed across the morning air. The pallbearers stood frozen, their knuckles white against the coffin handles. Villagers scrambled backward, women clutching their shawls tied around their shoulders, men pushing children behind them. The Bobcat's wild nature, usually tempered by Miriam's presence, now showed itself in full force. "Someone get that beast off there." Jonas's voice cracked with fury. He gestured at a group of younger men hovering nearby. "Well, what are you waiting for? Remove it." The men exchanged nervous glances. Thomas Cooper, the blacksmith's son, took a hesitant step forward, but quickly retreated when Lark's snarl deepened, showing gleaming fangs. "Nobody's fool enough to tackle a wild cat," Martha Jenkins muttered, earning several murmurs of agreement. Dr. Elias seized his chance, stepping forward with his medical bag clutched tight. "This is a sign. We must open the coffin. Check one more time. A sign?" Jonas whirled to face him, face flushed with anger. "The only sign here is that beast's loyalty to its dead master." "You've done enough damage, doctor. The whole village is in mourning because you couldn't save her." "Jonas, please," Elias pressed on, his voice steady despite his racing heart. "Listen to reason. I found evidence." "Evidence?" Jonas's laugh was harsh. "What evidence could possibly justify this? This circus? This insult to my sister's memory?" The villagers had begun taking sides, their whispered arguments growing heated. Sarah Miller, whose child Miriam had taught, spoke up. "Dr. Elias has served this village for 20 years. If he says something's wrong, like when he declared her dead in the first place." Robert Taylor cut in. We'll be the laughingstock of the county if we start digging up coffins based on a cat's behavior. Elias reached into his coat pocket, pulling out the medicine bottles. The glass clinked as he held them up. These were in Miriam's cabinet. Look at the labels. They were switched at the pharmacy. What she thought was heart medication was actually a powerful sedative. He turned to address the gathering crowd, his voice taking on the authoritative tone he used when explaining medical matters. This particular sedative, in high doses, can slow the heart and breathing to nearly undetectable levels. A person can appear dead to all normal examinations, especially with the limited tools I had that night. The crowd fell silent, considering his words. Even Jonas's expression flickered with uncertainty before hardening again. More excuses, Jonas spat, but his voice wavered slightly. You're just trying to cover your mistakes. Men, pick up that coffin. We're proceeding with the burial. The pallbearers hesitated, looking between Jonas and Elias. Lark remained crouched on the coffin lid, tail lashing, a living barrier between Miriam and her would-be burial. Think about it, Jonas, Elias pleaded. Why won't Lark leave her side? Animals sense things we can't. He knows she's still alive in there. Enough, Jonas roared. He stormed toward the pallbearers. I said, move. She's my sister, this is my decision. The pallbearers reluctantly bent to their task, preparing to lift the coffin despite Lark's presence. The Bobcat's growl grew louder, but they steeled themselves to continue. Elias saw his last chance slipping away. With surprising agility for his age, he darted forward and planted himself directly in their path, arms spread wide. If I'm wrong, blame me, he declared, his voice ringing clear in the morning air. But if I'm right, you're about to bury her alive. The morning air hung heavy with tension. No one moved, caught between Jonas's authority and Elias's desperate plea. Finally, William Porter, the eldest pallbearer, slowly lowered his corner of the coffin. I'm sorry, Jonas, he said quietly, but I won't risk it. One by one, the other pallbearers followed suit, gently setting the coffin on the grass. Jonas's face twisted with rage, but the quiet defiance in their eyes stopped his protests cold. Lark backed away just enough to let Elias approach, watching intently as the doctor knelt beside the coffin. Elias's hands trembled as he reached for the lid's clasps, fighting to steady them. Years of medical practice had trained his fingers for delicate work, but now they felt clumsy with urgency. The gathered villagers pressed closer, their breaths held, faces tight with anticipation. Children peered between adults' legs, and even the morning birds seemed to have fallen silent. The first clasp clicked open, then the second. Elias paused, gathering his courage, aware that his reputation, perhaps his whole career, hung on this moment. But more importantly, Miriam's life might depend on these next few seconds. The lid creaked as he lifted it, the sound impossibly loud in the hushed atmosphere. There lay Miriam, exactly as they'd prepared her, hands folded across her chest, skin pale as milk, lips slightly parted. Her gray hair had been neatly arranged around her face, and someone had placed a small sprig of lavender near her collar. Well, Jonas's voice dripped with bitter sarcasm. She looks just as dead as she did yesterday, Doctor. Are you satisfied now? Elias ignored him, leaning close to Miriam's face. He pressed his ear near her mouth, straining to detect the slightest breath. His fingers found her wrist, searching for any trace of a pulse in the cool skin. Nothing. Sweat beaded on his forehead, as he gently lifted her right eyelid with his thumb. The eye beneath was still, unseeing. A murmur of disappointment rippled through the crowd. Jonas's laugh was sharp and cruel. As I said, quiet, Elias snapped with such authority that even Jonas fell silent. The doctor hadn't moved, his thumb still holding Miriam's eyelid. His entire world had narrowed to this single point of focus. There, the faintest tremor beneath his thumb. He might have imagined it, but then he felt it through his fingers still pressed to her wrist. Flutter so delicate it was like a butterfly's wing against his skin. A trained physician might miss it if they weren't specifically looking for it, desperately hoping for it. She's alive, he whispered, then louder. She's alive. Gasps erupted from the crowd. Sarah Miller burst into tears. Little Tommy Jenkins squealed and grabbed his mother's skirts. Jonas staggered backward as if struck. His face drained of color, and his legs seemed barely able to hold him. This can't be, he muttered, shaking his head. It's impossible. Blankets? Elias shouted, his professional instincts taking over. I need blankets and hot water, quickly. The crowd burst into action. Women hurried toward nearby houses, calling out to each other about blankets and kettles. Men who had stood uncertain moments before now rushed to offer help. Martha Jenkins, who lived closest, yelled, "My house is nearest, bring her there." "Careful now," Elias directed as several men moved to lift Miriam. Gentle, she's very weak." Lark padded forward, pressing close to the coffin once more, but this time his posture was relaxed, watchful rather than defensive. He let out a soft chuff as if confirming Elias's discovery, and settled beside Miriam's still form, refusing to leave her side even as they prepared to move her. 4 strong men lifted Miriam carefully from the coffin, their movements slow and deliberate, like a solemn procession in reverse. They carried her down the hill from the cemetery and through the village streets toward the chapel with Elias, keeping pace beside them, checking her pulse every few steps. Inside the chapel's cool interior, they laid her on a cot that Mrs. Porter had hurriedly brought from her nearby home. Sunlight streamed through the stained glass windows, casting colorful patterns across Miriam's still form. The villagers crowded. Around the chapel doors and windows, their worried whispers echoing off the stone walls. "Give her space," Elias ordered, rolling up his sleeves. "Everyone back, please. I need room to work." The crowd reluctantly shuffled backward, though their eyes remained fixed on the scene before them. Lark settled at the foot of the cot, watching intently as Elias opened his medical bag. With practiced movements, Elias pulled out small bottles and instruments. His hands moved quickly now, steady with purpose where they had trembled before. He measured out careful drops of stimulant, lifting Miriam's head gently to administer the medicine. "Sarah," he called to Mrs. Miller, "keep those cloths coming. As hot as you can make them without burning." Sarah nodded, rushing to refresh the cloths in steaming water. Elias wrapped them around Miriam's limbs, trying to warm her body that had grown cold in the chapel overnight. Jonas paced near the altar, his footsteps echoing sharply. His earlier anger had dissolved into something rawer, more vulnerable. I just wanted her suffering to end," he muttered, running his hands through his hair. "She seemed in such pain lately. I thought—" Several villagers turned to glare at him, their expressions hard. Old Mr. Thompson spoke up, his voice rough with accusation. "Seemed mighty eager to get her in the ground, you did." "I never meant ... Jonas started, but his words trailed off as he continued his restless pacing. Elias ignored the exchange, all his attention focused on Miriam. He remembered reading about cases like this in his medical journals. People declared dead, only to wake hours or even days later. Pseudo-death, they called it, where life retreated so deep inside it became almost invisible to the outside world. He worked methodically, massaging her limbs to encourage circulation, checking her vital signs. Every few minutes, time seemed to crawl. The watching villagers shifted restlessly, some beginning to doubt, to wonder if they were witnessing nothing more than desperate denial. But Elias persisted. He replaced cooling cloths with fresh hot ones, administered another careful dose of stimulant, and kept up the steady rhythm of massage. "Come on, Miriam," he whispered. "Come back to us. Been a change." Subtle at first, but unmistakable. Her chest began to rise and fall with slightly deeper breaths. A hint of pink touched her bloodless lips. "Look!" Young Tommy Jenkins pointed excitedly. Her hand moved. Indeed, Miriam's fingers had twitched, not the isolated movement from before, but a definite flutter that several people witnessed. A wave of murmurs swept through the watching crowd. "Good Lord above," Martha Jenkins breathed, crossing herself. We almost... The reality of what they'd narrowly avoided began to sink in. They had been minutes away from lowering one of their own into the ground. Alive. The whispers grew more urgent. someone began to cry softly. Parents pulled their children closer, as if to protect them from the horror of the thought. Elias leaned forward intently as Miriam's eyelids flickered. Her chest rose in a deeper breath, and from her throat came a low, strangled groan. The doctor sank into a nearby chair, his own breath leaving him in a rush. Sweat dampened his collar, and his hands shook with released tension. "She's coming back to us," he whispered, a smile of pure relief breaking across his tired face. Evening shadows lengthened across the chapel floor as the sun dipped below the horizon. Candles flickered in their holders, casting warm light over the gathered. Villagers who had refused to leave, maintaining their vigil for a very different reason now. The soft murmur of quiet conversations filled the air, punctuated by the gentle purring of Lark, who hadn't moved from Miriam's side. On the cot, Miriam's fingers twitched again, more purposefully this time. Her eyelids fluttered, fighting against the weight of unconsciousness. Elias leaned forward in his chair, watching intently as awareness slowly returned to his patient's face. Finally, her eyes opened, just barely, but enough to catch the candlelight. She blinked slowly, confusion evident in her unfocused gaze. "Hey, Elias." Her voice was barely a whisper, rough from disuse. The doctor quickly moved to support her head, helping her take small sips of water. "I'm here, Miriam. You're safe now." His voice was gentle, professional mask barely hiding his relief. Tears began to well in Miriam's eyes as fragments of memory surfaced. "I had such terrible dreams," she whispered. "I was trapped in darkness, so cold. I couldn't move." Her voice broke as she struggled to explain. "I could hear voices sometimes, like they were far away, but I couldn't call out. My body felt so heavy, like it wasn't mine anymore." Several of the villagers wiped their eyes. The horror of her experience hitting home. Mrs. Porter pressed a handkerchief to her mouth, shoulders shaking with silent sobs. If it weren't for Dr. Elias, double quotes Sarah Miller started, but couldn't finish. He wouldn't give up. Tommy Jenkins piped up from where he stood with his mother. "Even when they were when they were taking you away, he made them stop." "And Lark?" added Martha Jenkins, gesturing to the Bobcat. That creature knew. "Wouldn't leave your side, wouldn't let them take you." Miriam's hand found Lark's fur, fingers weakly tangling in it as the big cat pressed closer, still purring. The sound seemed to steady her as more tears fell. Jonas, who had been hanging back in the shadows, suddenly moved forward. His face was drawn with anguish as he fell to his knees beside the cot. "Miriam," he choked out. "I'm so sorry. I would have ... double quotes." He couldn't continue, his shoulders shaking. "Jonas?" Miriam turned her head slightly, struggling to focus on her brother's face. "It's my fault," he confessed, voice raw with guilt. "Last month when I picked up your medicine. I was careless. Didn't check the labels properly. And then today I was so quick to want it over with." His words dissolved into quiet sobs. Miriam's hand moved slowly across the blanket. Toward her brother, though weak, her gesture was deliberate, fingers reaching for his. "Jonas," she whispered, "take my hand." He grabbed it like a drowning man clutching a lifeline, pressing her cool fingers between his warm ones. "We're family," Miriam said, softly. Each word an effort, but clear with conviction. "Life gives us burdens, but we face them together. No more carrying guilt alone." The simple forgiveness in her words seemed to break something in Jonas. He pressed his forehead against their clasped hands, tears falling freely now. The candlelight flickered as night deepened outside the chapel windows. The villagers gradually grew quieter, some departing with final whispered prayers of thanks. Miriam's eyes began to grow heavy again, the effort of consciousness taking its toll. "Rest now," Elias instructed gently, adjusting her blankets. "You're safe." Miriam's eyes closed, her breathing evening out into the deeper rhythm of natural sleep. Lark shifted position, curling protectively against her side. Yellow eyes gleaming in the candle light. Elias stood slowly, muscles stiff from hours of vigilance. He made his way to the chapel door, stepping out into the cool night air. Above him, stars sparkled in the clear sky, seemingly brighter than usual. Standing there, surrounded by the peaceful darkness, he made a silent vow to himself. Never again would he let routine or complacency cloud his judgment when a life hung in the balance. Dawn crept through the chapel windows, painting the stone walls with soft amber light. The night's vigil had taken its toll on the remaining villagers, who gathered their shawls and coats, casting final glances at Miriam's sleeping form before quietly departing. Their footsteps echoed on the wooden floor as they filed out, leaving only Jonas Elias and the ever-watchful Lark inside the sacred space. Miriam lay peaceful on the cot, her chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm that seemed stronger than the night before. The color had returned to her cheeks, replacing the deathly pallor that had haunted them all. Lark remained curled against her side, yellow eyes half closed but alert to every movement in the chapel. Elias moved with practiced care as he approached the cot. His fingers found her wrist, counting the beats of her pulse while watching the second hand of his pocket watch tick by. The steady thrum beneath his fingertips brought a smile to his tired face. "Her pulse is stronger," he announced, softly to Jonas, who hovered nearby. "She's stabilizing, though she'll be very weak for some time." Elias tucked her arm back under the blanket with gentle precision. "When she wakes, she needs water and something light to eat. Could you fetch some from your home?" Jonas nodded, quickly, eager to be useful. "Of course. I have some fresh bread, and I could make her favorite honey tea." His voice was rough from the long night, but carried none of his usual defensiveness. As Jonas took a step closer to check on his sister, Lark's head snapped up. The bobcat's ears flattened, a low growl rumbling in its throat. Jonas froze, pain flashing across his face at the animal's continued distrust. "Easy now, Lark," Elias soothed, his voice calm and steady. "Jonas is helping. We're all here for Miriam." The doctor's gentle tone seemed to ease some of the tension from the bobcat's posture, though its eyes remained fixed on Jonas. Miriam stirred on the cot, her head turning slightly on the pillow. "Jonas. She whispered, the name barely audible. Her eyes didn't open, and she soon settled back into sleep. But the effect on her brother was profound. Jonas staggered back as if struck, his face a mask of raw emotion. That his sister would call for him, even in her vulnerable state after he had nearly condemned her to a horrifying fate, seemed to pierce straight through his carefully maintained walls. He pressed a trembling hand to his mouth, trying to contain a sob. "She knows you're here," Elias said quietly. "Despite everything, she wants her brother close." Jonas nodded, unable to speak. After a moment, he gathered himself and moved toward the chapel door, his steps unsteady. I'll get that food and water ready," he managed to say before slipping out into the morning light. The sunrise painted the chapel in increasingly brilliant hues, dust motes dancing in the beams that streaked through the windows. Outside, a small crowd had gathered, villagers who couldn't bear to go home, who needed to know their beloved schoolteacher would truly recover. Elias did one final check of Miriam's vital signs, satisfying himself that she was continuing to improve. Her breathing remained steady and natural, her skin warm to the touch. The terrible stillness of the sedative's grip had finally released her. Walking to the chapel doors, Elias opened them wide, letting in the fresh morning air. The waiting villagers pressed forward, their faces anxious and hopeful. Some had been there all night, others had just arrived, drawn back by their concern for Miriam, looking out at their worried faces. Elias delivered the news they'd been praying to hear. She lives, but her recovery will be long. Gasps of relief rippled through the crowd, followed by murmurs of thanksgiving and joy that carried into the crisp morning air like a prayer. Sunlight streamed through the chapel's stained glass, windows casting colorful patterns across the stone floor. Miriam sat propped up against pillows on the cot, her face pale but alert, as Elias carefully brought a spoonful of steaming broth to her lips. Her hands trembled as she tried to grasp the spoon herself. "Let me help," Elias said gently, steadying her grip. You need to conserve your strength. Miriam managed a few more sips before letting her hand drop back to her lap. Her voice was hoarse, but stronger than before. What happened to me? I remember being in my kitchen, and then everything went dark. Elias set the bowl aside, his expression grave. There was a serious mistake with your medication, he explained, choosing his words carefully. The bottles were mislabeled. Instead of your heart medicine, you received a powerful sedative, the overdose. He paused, drawing a deep breath. It slowed your vital signs so much that I mistakenly declared you dead. Miriam's eyes widened as the implications sank in. You mean I was ... Yes, Elias confirmed softly. We very nearly buried you alive. If it hadn't been for Lark's behavior and my eventual discovery of the medication error, we would have. He couldn't finish the sentence. A visible shudder ran through Miriam's body. She reached down to stroke Lark's fur, the bobcat pressing. Closer against her leg in response, Jonas, who had been hovering nearby, stepped forward. His face was etched with anguish. Miriam, there's something I need to tell you. His voice quavered. This might be my fault. Miriam turned to look at her brother, her expression questioning, but not accusatory. Remember last month, when I picked up your prescriptions? Jonas continued, his words tumbling out. I was in such a hurry. The pharmacist tried to explain something about the labels, but I just ... I brushed him off, said I knew what I was doing. He ran a trembling hand through his hair. I never double-checked anything. I was so certain I knew better, so impatient to get back to my own affairs. Tears spilled down his cheeks as he sank to his knees beside her cot. You almost died because of my carelessness. And then ... then I tried to rush your burial. I can't bear it, Miriam. I can't bear what I almost did to you. Miriam was quiet for a long moment, her hand still moving slowly through Lark's fur. When she spoke, her voice was soft but steady. Forgiveness isn't weakness, Jonas, but trust ... Trust is like a broken vessel. It can be mended, but it takes time and care. She met his eyes. Are you willing to do that work? Jonas seized her. Free hand, pressing it between both of his. Yes, he sobbed. Yes, anything. I'll spend the rest of my life making this right. I swear it. Miriam turned her attention to Lark, who had maintained his protective position throughout the conversation. You never left me, did you? She whispered to the bobcat. You knew all along. Elias watched the scene unfold, struck by the profound loyalty of the animal who had refused to abandon Miriam when everyone else had failed her. Lark's instincts had proven truer than all their human certainties. The emotional exchange had clearly drained what little strength Miriam had regained. Her eyelids began to droop, her hand growing slack in Jonas's grip. She needs rest, Elias said quietly, adjusting her pillows as she drifted off to sleep. Jonas reluctantly released her hand, placing it gently on top of the blanket. Without speaking, he and Elias moved toward the chapel doors, stepping out into the sun-drenched courtyard. The unspoken weight of their shared responsibility, one a doctor who had declared her dead, the other a brother who had nearly sealed her fate, hung heavy in the air between them. The afternoon sun beat down on the village square as clusters of people gathered in tight circles, their voices rising and falling with concern and anger. Children who usually played among the wooden market stalls stood quietly beside their parents, sensing the gravity in the air. How could this happen? Martha, the baker's wife, demanded. We trust our medicines with our lives. It's that brother of hers, Thomas, the carpenter, shot back. Always in such a rush, thinking he knows better than everyone else. Now look what his pride almost cost us. Another villager chimed in. But what about our own prescriptions? How do we know they're safe? The murmurs grew louder, fear mixing with outrage. Some cast accusing glances toward the pharmacy, while others shook their heads at Jonas, who sat alone on a bench at the edge of the square. His shoulders were slumped, his face etched with shame as he endured their whispers and pointed fingers. Dr. Elias emerged from his clinic, his medical bag in hand. The crowd parted as he approached the center of the square, their conversations falling silent. He looked tired but determined, his usually pristine collar wrinkled from hours of watching over Miriam. "Friends," he began, his voice carrying across the square. "I know you're frightened and angry. What nearly happened to Miriam should never occur in any civilized place." He paused, scanning the faces before him. "But I must first acknowledge my own grave error." A ripple of surprise moved through the crowd. They hadn't expected this admission. "As your doctor, I declared Miriam dead without sufficient verification. I allowed the dim light and my outdated tools to justify a hasty judgment." His voice grew, heavy with emotion. The sedative in her system did indeed mimic death, slowing her pulse and breath to nearly imperceptible levels. "But that's precisely why we must be more thorough, more careful." The villagers listened intently as Elias continued. "From this day forward, I propose new procedures for declaring death in our village. First, multiple examinations over several hours, not just one. Second, verification by at least 2 qualified people when possible. And third, in cases where there's any doubt, we must transport the patient to the regional hospital for proper confirmation." Martha raised her hand. "But that's nearly half a day's journey." "Better a long journey than a premature burial," Elias responded firmly. "What happened to Miriam has opened my eyes. Our current practices are dangerously outdated." The crowd began nodding, their earlier anger giving way to thoughtful consideration. Even those who had been most vocal in their accusations fell silent, contemplating how this near tragedy might prevent future disasters. "As for our medicines," Elias added, "I'll be working with the pharmacy to implement better labeling systems and double-checking procedures. No prescription will be released without thorough verification." From his solitary bench, Jonas listened, accepting each word like a deserved blow. When someone glanced his way with a sneer, he didn't flinch or defend himself. He understood their anger. It matched his own self-loathing as the crowd slowly dispersed, their discussions now focused on Elias's proposed changes rather than laying blame. The doctor made his way back to the chapel. The setting sun painted the windows in deep amber hues as he entered inside. He found Miriam awake, her eyes clearer than they'd been all day. Lark dozed at her feet, one eye cracking open to acknowledge Elias's presence. She reached out as he approached, her thin fingers grasping his hand with surprising strength. "Promise me," she whispered, her voice urgent despite its weakness. "Promise me this won't happen to anyone else." Elias knelt beside her cot, bowing his head over their clasped hands. "I promise you, Miriam," he vowed solemnly. "What happened to you will help protect others. Never again will we be so careless with a life in this village." The chapel's stone walls held the night's deepening silence, broken only by the gentle pop and hiss of the lantern flame. Shadows danced across the vaulted ceiling as Miriam lay on her cot, her breath finally falling into an even rhythm. Jonas sat in a wooden chair beside her, his shoulders hunched, hands clasped between his knees. At a small desk near the altar, Elias's quill scratched steadily across parchment as he detailed new protocols for verifying death in the village. Miriam stirred, her eyes finding Jonas in the dim light. "Do you remember?" she began softly, her voice still rough but stronger. "Than before, when we were children." Jonas lifted his head, uncertainty crossing his features. The years of distance between them seemed to stretch like a vast canyon, but in her near death, those memories suddenly felt precious. "Tell me about then," she urged gently, "before everything got so complicated." Jonas shifted in his chair, running a hand through his graying hair. I'm not sure what to remember the day behind the schoolhouse." Miriam prompted, "When Thomas Wheeler and his friends cornered you." A faint smile tugged at Jonas's lips. "You came charging in? Like a wild thing," he said, his voice warming with the memory. "Didn't matter that you were half their size." "They were being cruel," Miriam recalled, "and no one hurts my little brother." "You grabbed Thomas by his ear," Jonas continued, chuckling softly. "Marched him straight to the schoolmaster. I'd never seen anyone stand up to him before." You were worth standing up for, Miriam said quietly. You still are. Lark stretched lazily between them, extending each limb before padding over to curl up at Miriam's feet. Jonas watched the bobcat settle, and for the first time since this ordeal began, he didn't tense or draw back. Something in him had shifted. Seeing how the animal had known what they all missed, that Miriam still lived at his desk. Elias paused in his writing, listening to their exchange. His quill hovered over the page as he considered how close they'd come to losing this moment forever. One hasty decision, one careless error with medication, and Miriam's gentle voice would have been silenced forever. The weight of that responsibility pressed heavily on his shoulders. I should have been there for you more, Jonas admitted, his voice thick with emotion. After Richard passed, when you withdrew from everyone, I should have tried harder. We both built walls, Miriam responded softly. Perhaps it's time to tear them down. Her eyes began to droop, exhaustion creeping back in despite her efforts to stay awake. Jonas leaned forward, adjusting her blanket with unexpected tenderness. Rest now, he murmured. I'll be right here. I'm not leaving until you're strong again. Miriam's breathing deepened as she drifted into sleep, more peaceful than she'd been since her collapse. Jonas watched her face in the lantern light. As if trying to memorize every detail he'd taken for granted before, Elias rose quietly from his desk, needing a moment of fresh air. He stepped outside into the chapel courtyard, where stars scattered across the velvet black sky like diamonds. The crisp night air filled his lungs as he gazed upward, considering how nearly this night might have found Miriam buried beneath the earth instead of sleeping safely inside. Never again, he whispered to the stars, the words carrying the weight of a sacred vow. Then he turned and went back inside to continue his vigil. The lantern's warm light, welcoming him back to his post-morning light, streamed through the chapel's stained glass windows, casting colorful patterns across the stone floor. Miriam sat upright on her cot, her face pale but determined. Though her hands still trembled slightly when she moved, her eyes held a familiar spark of stubborn resolve. I need to go home, she announced, her voice stronger than had been in days. I can't stay in this chapel forever. Elias knelt beside her, checking her pulse with practiced fingers. Your heart rate is steadier, he admitted, but you must promise not to overexert yourself. No teaching, no heavy work, nothing strenuous, for at least a week. I'll make sure she rests. Jonas spoke up from where he stood nearby. His usual gruffness had softened, replaced by an almost anxious eagerness to help. I can stay with her? Keep an eye on things? Miriam looked at her brother, surprise flickering across her features. After years of distance, his offer touched something deep within her. Very well, Elias conceded, helping Miriam to her feet. She swayed slightly but remained standing, Clark pressing against her legs for support. We'll take you home in Thomas Wheeler's cart. The walk would be too much right now. Word spread quickly through the village. As Jonas and Elias helped Miriam outside, they found a crowd gathered in the chapel yard. Faces that days ago had been grief-stricken, now beamed with joy and relief. Several women dabbed at their eyes with handkerchiefs. Oh, Miss Miriam, Martha Reed called out, her voice thick with emotion. We're so sorry we believed that we almost ... She couldn't finish, overcome by the memory of what nearly happened. Miriam smiled gently as Jonas helped her settle into the cart's cushioned seat. There's nothing to forgive, she said, her voice carrying clearly despite its softness. But remember this, we must always question what we're told, even by those in authority. Blind trust can be as dangerous as no trust at all. The villagers nodded solemnly, understanding the weight of her words. They watched as the cart began its careful journey through the village streets toward Miriam's cottage at her home. Jonas surprised everyone with his attentiveness. He helped Miriam inside with unexpected gentleness, then busied himself preparing tea while Elias rearranged furniture to create a comfortable rest area near the fireplace. The warmth will do you good, Elias explained as he positioned her favorite chair and footstool, and it's closer to the kitchen than your bedroom. Lark jumped onto the chair the moment Miriam settled into it, curling up beside her with a contented purr. Jonas returned with the tea, his movements awkward, as he tried to arrange blankets around her, without disturbing the bobcat, watching him struggle with the blanket corners. Miriam couldn't help herself. A small laugh escaped her lips. Tired, but genuine. The first real laughter anyone had heard from her in years. Jonas paused, looking startled, then joined in with his own deep chuckle, though his eyes glistened with the memory of how close they'd come to losing these moments forever. Elias pulled up a chair, his expression turning serious. "I've begun implementing new procedures in the village," he explained, pulling out a carefully written document. "No death will be declared without extended observation and verification from at least 2 medical practitioners. We're also instituting stricter controls at the pharmacy, double-checking of labels, better record keeping." Miriam nodded approvingly. "Then some good may come from all this," she said softly. "If it prevents anyone else from going through what I did, what we all did, then perhaps it wasn't all for nothing." As evening approached, the cottage grew quiet. The fire crackled softly, casting warm light across the room. Jonas had fallen asleep in a chair nearby, his usual stern expression softened in slumber. Miriam stayed awake, one hand absently stroking Lark's fur as she watched her brother's peaceful face. "Perhaps we're not so alone anymore," she whispered, the firelight dancing across her features as she spoke. The words into the comfortable silence. The garden burst with color as spring embraced. The countryside. Purple crocuses and yellow daffodils dotted the freshly turned earth, their faces turned toward the warm sun. Miriam walked slowly between the flower beds, one hand resting lightly on Jonas's arm, while Elias followed close behind, watching her. Progress with a doctor's careful eye. "You're getting stronger every day," Elias noted with satisfaction, as Miriam paused to admire a patch of blooming tulips. "Thanks to both of you," she replied, her voice clear and steady. Among the trees at the garden's edge, Lark bounded after a butterfly, his playful antics drawing smiles from all three. The villagers no longer whispered fearfully about the bobcat. Instead, they spoke of him with reverence, the faithful guardian who had known truth when humans faltered. "Mrs. Thompson asked me to check her husband's heart medicine again yesterday," Jonas mentioned, helping Miriam settle onto a wooden bench. "That's the 3rd family this week." Elias nodded, pleased. People are finally understanding the importance of verification. I've started keeping detailed records of every prescription in the village. He patted the leather satchel he now carried everywhere. No more mix-ups, no more assumptions. The village had indeed changed. Where once they'd accepted medical matters without question, now they approached everything with careful consideration. Elias had transformed his small office into a proper practice, teaching interested villagers about common medications and their effects. Jonas, determined to make amends, had become his dedicated assistant, meticulously organizing records and delivering medicines with precise attention to detail. That evening, as they sat around Miriam's fireplace, a routine that had become comfortable and familiar, she spoke of something she'd never shared before. Her voice was quiet but steady as she described the terrifying hours of her near burial. "I could hear everything," she said, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "The mourners, the prayers, the planning for my funeral. But I couldn't move, couldn't speak, couldn't even open my eyes." She drew a shaky breath. It was like being trapped in the darkest night imaginable, except the darkness was my own body. Jonas leaned forward in his chair, his face etched with pain. Elias sat perfectly still, his medical journal forgotten in his hands. "But, Lark," Miriam continued, glancing at the bobcat dozing by the hearth. "Lark never left me. I could feel his warmth against my side, hear his purring. It reminded me I wasn't truly alone." She smiled faintly. "Perhaps that's what kept me holding on. That connection to life when everyone else had declared me dead." The three sat in silence for a long moment, each lost in their own thoughts. Without speaking, they understood their shared purpose now, to protect life and all its precious details. To never again let carelessness or assumption put anyone at risk. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across Miriam's front porch. She sat in her favorite rocking chair, watching Jonas split wood for her fireplace. The rhythmic thunk of the axe blended with the scratch of Elias's pen as he updated his medical records, sitting at the small table they'd moved outside to enjoy. The spring evening lark sprawled contentedly at Miriam's feet, his tail twitching occasionally as he dozed in the fading sunlight. The scene was one of perfect peace. Brother and friend nearby, her faithful companion at her feet, the garden blooming with new life. Miriam's fingers absently stroked Lark's fur as she gazed at the golden horizon. Not death, but life, she whispered softly to herself. Life found me again. I believe stories like this find us for a reason. If this one touched you, please subscribe. I share a new one every day, and tomorrow's might be the one your heart's been waiting for.